What started as a routine stroll through Willow Creek Market turned into a 4-minute nightmare. A simple silk dress, a single question, and one officer's deadly mistake triggered an investigation that would shake the system. You won't believe who she really was, and what happened next will leave you speechless. It was a little after 8 o'clock that Saturday morning when the very first beams of soft sunlight slipped through the tall oak trees that lined the narrow streets of Willow Creek. Like every weekend, the market was already buzzing. Stalls popped up along the old brick roads, their colorful canopies swaying gently in the morning breeze. You could smell fresh bread baking somewhere close, mixing with the sweet, sharp scent of ripe oranges. The whole place smelled like small-town America at its finest. Peaceful, predictable, or at least, that's what folks thought. Shoppers wandered from stand to stand, sipping hot coffee and catching up on this week's gossip. But then something changed. You could feel it like a ripple cutting through still water. People slowed their steps. Conversations got quiet. Heads started to turn. The reason, a woman, Elena Brooks. She stepped onto the market's path like a soft breeze on a humid summer morning. She was tall, about 5'9", with smooth, cocoa brown skin that caught the light just right, almost like polished stone. Her hair was pulled back into a perfect bun, not a strand out of place. No sunglasses, no jewelry, no purse hanging off her arm. She didn't need any of that. Her presence was enough. But what really caught every single eye was her dress. She wore this long, lavender silk dress, high collar, full sleeves, and the fabric floated around her ankles with every step. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't trying too hard. But it had weight. The kind of quiet power that you can't fake. And under that morning sunlight, the silk shimmered like moonlit water, making her seem almost unreal. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She didn't have to. Just being there was enough to split the usual rhythm of Willow Creek's weekend market wide open. At the honey stand, one woman whispered, her voice just a notch above the hum of the bees. "Who is she?" "Never seen her before," another replied, pulling her little boy closer to her side. Behind the bakery counter, a man pretended to fix his apron but couldn't take his eyes off Elena. "New around here," he mumbled under his breath. No one answered him. See? In Willow Creek. Everybody noticed strangers, but a black woman. Alone. Dressed in silk that was a different kind of attention. She didn't fit into the unspoken rules of the market blend in. Smile nice, don't stand out too much. But Elena Brooks broke every single one of those rules simply by showing up. As she moved past rows of homegrown tomatoes and big, bright sunflower bouquets, the air grew thicker. The market chatter turned sticky like syrup. Folks tried to pretend like they weren't watching, but they couldn't help themselves. Some stared outright. Others ducked their heads, pretending to be real interested in the peaches or the pickles. But every single pair of eyes kept drifting back to her. "She thinks she's some kind of royalty or something," muttered an old man near the used book stall. His buddy gave a nervous little laugh, but didn't say much more. The truth was, it wasn't what Elena was doing that made folks nervous, it was what she wasn't doing. She wasn't shrinking. She wasn't offering up polite smiles. She wasn't playing by their small-town script. And that made people uneasy. In Willow Creek, politeness was everything. And deference, that was expected especially from outsiders, especially from people like her. She passed a row of snack stalls, the smell of fried dough heavy in the air, mixing with fresh oranges. A small boy tugged at his mama's hand, eyes wide as he watched the lavender silk float with each of her steps. The mother leaned down quick, whispered something in his ear, and pulled him along a little faster. Elena paused for a moment at the old wooden map nailed to a post near the market's edge. She traced a gloved finger along the faded lines. Stopping at the marker for the community supply depot, a place most folks under 30 didn't even know existed anymore. She could feel the stairs piling up behind her. But she stayed calm. Didn't rush. Didn't flinch. She knew stillness could be its own kind of power. The whispers behind her grew thicker. She's not from here. She's hiding something. What kind of woman comes to a place like this? Alone, across the produce stand. A few men chuckled, just loud enough for everyone to hear. Maybe she's waiting for somebody, one said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Maybe she just wants the attention. The women standing nearby exchanged glances but stayed silent. They knew better. Around here, speaking up could get you noticed in all the wrong ways. Then, it happened, like a hammer cracking glass. "What are you hiding under that silk dress?" The voice came sharp and loud from the fruit vendor heavyset. Maybe in his 40s. Sweat already rolling down his temple under a worn ball cap. His stall overflowed with bananas and peaches, stacked up in messy piles. The words hit the air like a slap. Elena didn't move, didn't even turn her head. She just kept her eyes fixed on that map. The question hung there, sour and heavy. Somebody nearby let out a nervous laugh, short, harsh, like a bad joke you regret halfway through. But nobody said a word to the vendor. Nobody stepped in. The silence thickened like humid air right before a storm. And still, Elena stood solid, unshaken, unbothered. Then, like clockwork, came the sharp click of boots echoing from the far end of the market. 2 officers. The first one was tall, buzz-cut sharp as a blade, sunglasses still perched on his face even though the morning sun wasn't strong yet. The second was younger, thinner, walking just half a step behind him. Their pace was steady, measured, firm enough to make a few shoppers instinctively step back toward the stalls. The market shifted again. Heads lowered, eyes darted away, but nobody left. They all knew exactly what was coming. It wasn't justice. It was the thing they'd seen before. The thing nobody wanted to talk about. The taller officer stepped up close, way too close, and the lavender silk around Elena's legs fluttered from the small draft of his movement. The badge on his chest gleamed in the sunlight as he spoke, his words dripping with something cold and hungry. "Where are you headed? All covered up like that, hiding those curves." The entire market held its breath. The storm had arrived. The words hung there like a thick fog that refused to lift. "What are you hiding under that silk?" Miss Tommy Wells's voice carried farther than the distance deserved. He didn't shout it, no. His tone was casual, oily, and loud enough for everyone to hear, but soft enough to pretend it was nothing more than playful banter. His southern drawl dragged the words out just a little longer than necessary, like he wanted to savor the discomfort they caused. The market froze. It was maybe 8:15 now, and you could feel it, that heavy pause in the air, like the whole world had stopped breathing. The soft hum of conversation that usually danced through Willow Creek's weekend market vanished in an instant. The sizzling oil at the donut stand still crackled, but even that sound felt muted. The scent of bread, fresh peaches, and fried dough floated untouched in the humid summer air, hanging there like ghosts. Nobody moved, nobody spoke, but every single person heard Tommy's words. Elena Brooks didn't move either. She stood exactly where she had been, facing the faded wooden market map. one gloved finger still gently resting near the marker for the old supply depot. Her shoulders stayed square. Her chin held its height. Her back stayed straight, like a steel rod was running through her spine. Not a flinch, not even a twitch. The lavender silk of her dress shimmered slightly as the morning breeze caught the hem, making the fabric ripple like water. But the woman herself. She stood as still as stone. Tommy Wells was a man who made a living selling bruised fruit and sour jokes. He ran his stall out of a beat-up old pickup parked crooked under a crooked tarp near the market's west entrance. His shirt was 2 sizes too small, his gut pressed against the fabric like dough rising out of a pan, and sweat rolled freely down his temple in the rising heat. His voice always carried. It always had. And today, he made sure of it. The problem wasn't just what Tommy said Willow Creek had heard its fair share of ugly words. Before, it was the fact that nobody challenged him. That's what made it dangerous. A few heads snapped in his direction at first, wide-eyed, as though waiting for someone, anyone, to speak up. But when no voice rose in protest, those same heads quickly turned back toward stalls filled with jars of honey, bundles of carrots, and cheap wind chimes. A few folks suddenly discovered their shoelaces needed adjusting. Others grabbed at their coffee cups, sipping nervously like the liquid would somehow wash away their responsibility to act. A young mother clutching a paper bag full of apples tugged her daughter gently away. She whispered softly into her little girl's ear, eyes forward, "Baby, let's keep moving." The child, no more than 7 or 8 years old, glanced back at Elena, her wide brown eyes filled with questions she was too young to form. On the other side of the tomato stand, 2 older women who'd been chatting about church events now stood stiff, mouths tightly shut. One woman bit her lip hard enough to turn it white. The other clutched her purse a little tighter to her chest. They didn't look at Elena. They didn't look at Tommy. They just stared at nothing at all, the safest place to look when decency collides with fear. And Tommy? He grinned. His teeth were yellowed, crooked. His voice came again, this time just a touch louder. "Didn't mean no harm. Folks, just askin' a simple question. Silk's meant to be looked at. Ain't it? Ain't that why you wear it?" The words dripped from his mouth like syrup over stale pancakes. He chuckled, as if he'd made the cleverest joke Willow Creek had ever heard. Still, no one laughed. Not this time. But no one stopped him either. Tommy saw the silence as permission. You see, in a town like Willow Creek, silence wasn't just avoidance, it was survival. People had learned over the years that challenging the wrong man, at the wrong time, could come back to bite you in ways you couldn't predict. Jobs, reputations, safety. So instead, they waited, they watched, and they told themselves it wasn't their place. But that silence, that cowardly, sticky silence, was the loudest thing in the market. Elena's stillness wasn't weakness, it was power. She knew exactly what Tommy was doing, what everyone else was allowing. She knew that one word, one wrong move, could flip the script and turn her from victim to aggressor in an instant. She knew that for some people, dignity could be stolen not with violence, but with humiliation performed in front of a silent, complicit audience. The sun climbed higher, breaking through the leaves, casting long, sharp shadows across the uneven bricks beneath her feet. The heat pressed down like a heavy hand. It was now close to 8:30, and still, she stood there. The market wasn't big, maybe 15 stalls running up and down both sides of Willow Creek's main square, but in that moment, it felt like a stage, Dozens of people playing extras in a scene they didn't want to be part of. Every eye darted back and forth, afraid to settle too long on Elena or Tommy for fear of becoming involved. A young man, probably in his early 20s, stood frozen behind the lemonade stand. His hand gripped the plastic pitcher so tightly his knuckles turned white. You could see it in his eyes, that pull. That instinct. He wanted to say something. He really did. But his lips never moved. His courage died in his throat. Tommy's voice broke through again. One final time. Nastier now. Emboldened by the inaction around him. What's the matter? Miss Cat got your tongue? You ain't got nothing to say. His grin widened like a predator cornering easy prey. That's when it happened. The tension, thick enough to cut with a knife, was sliced clean by the sudden sharp click of approaching footsteps. The hard rubber soles of government-issued boots hitting the brick path in a steady, deliberate rhythm. 4 heavy steps. 6. 8. And then they appeared. 2 officers, one older, one younger, both dressed in starched Navy uniforms with Willow Creek Police Department stitched in gold thread across their chests. The older officer, taller by a good head, wore mirrored sunglasses even though the morning sun barely peeked above the rooftops. His buzz cut was perfect. His jaw locked tight. The younger officer kept half a step behind, his gaze flicking nervously between his partner and the crowd, as though sensing something deeper at play. As soon as they arrived, the air in Willow Creek changed again. The bystanders, already frozen, shrank back just a little more. Breaths were held, shoulders stiffened, and though no one spoke, everyone thought the same thing. Now it begins. The harassment wasn't over. No, it was only getting started. The silence that had weighed heavy over Willow Creek's market was shattered by the steady crunch of boots against weathered brick. Officer Grant Mallory arrived like a storm front, slow, ominous, and impossible to ignore. He was a big man, 6'3", built like a battering ram wrapped in a polished badge. The morning sun glinted off the silver WCPD emblem on his chest, as if daring the world to question his authority. Behind him, half a step back, trailed Jason Ellis, fresh out of the academy. Not even 6 months on the job. Jason was younger, thinner, and though his uniform was as sharp as Grant's, his eyes carried something different: hesitation. His right hand hovered near his belt, not out of readiness, but like a man unsure of where to put his hands when the world around him felt wrong. The marketplace seemed to breathe in one collective gasp when they appeared. It was now just past 8:30, and the heat had already begun pressing down, thick and sticky like syrup. The rising sun glared off the metal roofs of vendor stalls, making the colors sharper, the shadows darker. But all eyes were on the 3 people at the center: Elena Brooks, standing silent in her lavender silk dress; Tommy Wells, still grinning like a fool near his fruit stand; and now, Officer Grant Mallory, who had already decided exactly how this scene was going to play out. Grant slowed his approach, his polished boots stopping less than 2 feet from Elena. Close, too close. The kind of distance that turned breathing space into a pressure cooker. He tilted his head, lowering his sunglasses just enough to make eye contact. "Well now," he said, his voice low and smooth, like oil sliding across wet pavement. "What do we have here?" Elena didn't respond. She never flinched, never broke the stillness she had carried since the moment she stepped into the market. But her eyes, those deep, unwavering eyes, met his without blinking. Grant smiled, the corners of his mouth twisting upward in a way that wasn't pleasant. "I'm Officer Mallory, ma'am. Just a routine check. Nothing for you to worry your pretty little head about." His voice dripped with false politeness, but his body language betrayed his intent. There was no routine check here. This was theater. This was control. And the market audience stood frozen, unwilling to intervene, yet unable to look away. Jason Ellis lingered behind. Glancing at the surrounding crowd, he caught the eyes of a few market-goers, people he recognized from his first few months on patrol. They looked at him not with support, but with a silent plea, "Do something." His throat tightened. His training hadn't prepared him for this kind of moment. Grant continued circling Elena slowly, like a vulture sizing up a target. "Strangers don't often stroll through Willow Creek dressed up like that," he murmured, voice dropping to a near whisper meant for her ears but loud enough for the nearby crowd to catch the tone. "Kinda hard not to attract attention." "Wouldn't you say, still?" Elena said nothing. Her silence wasn't submission, it was power. She had learned long ago that words could be twisted, but silence held its own blade. Grant stepped closer, his breath warm and sour in the summer heat. The hem of her silk dress rippled slightly as he shifted position, the fabric catching the faint morning breeze that swept lazily through the narrow marketplace. "Now, we wouldn't want anyone thinking you're hiding something beneath all that silk, would we?" His hand hovered dangerously close to her side. Jason's breath caught. His pulse thumped loudly in his ears as Grant reached out. The crowd, stiff as statues, barely dared to breathe. Without warning, in one swift and practiced motion, Grant's thick fingers pinched the edge of Elena's lavender dress and lifted it only slightly, but enough for everyone to see the flash of movement. Enough to mock her dignity. Enough to humiliate her. It was not an accident. It was not part of any search. It was an act done not for law, but for power. For spectacle. Grant smirked, holding the fabric up for no more than 2 seconds before releasing it. The silk fell gently back into place, swaying like a pendulum, as if the dress itself was embarrassed by what had just happened. He chuckled under his breath, pretending it was all innocent. "Just doing my job." "Ma'am?" he said, as though mocking her for not reacting. Around them, the market stood frozen, paralyzed by that awful tension that lives in small towns, the kind that tells people it's not your fight. Some shoppers turned their heads quickly, pretending to study jars of jam or bundles of sunflowers. Others stood helpless, trapped between fear and shame. Only the smallest children stared openly, too young to understand why the adults around them pretended this wasn't happening. Jason Ellis swallowed hard. His fingers twitched at his side. Every fiber in his body screamed at him that this was wrong. But his training, his fear, his sense of loyalty to the badge to Mallory pinned him like an invisible hand against the back wall of his own conscience. Grant leaned in once more, his voice softer but dripping with venom. "No need to get all worked up. You're free to move along, unless you've got something you want to tell us." Elena didn't move. Her stillness was no longer just a defense. It was a statement. It was control. In the middle of the public stage, under the oppressive weight of dozens of unseen witnesses, she stood with the same unwavering posture she had held since stepping into Willow Creek that morning. Grant may have reached for her dress, but he hadn't touched her dignity. That remained firmly in her possession. And that was what rattled him most. From the corner of the market, Tommy Wells chuckled again, low and cowardly. "Told ya. She's hiding something. The words landed like a final taunt, emboldening Grant further. But before he could escalate his display of control any further, a low engine hum broke through the still air. From the far end of the market, a black SUV rolled slowly into view, its matte finish gleaming under the sun, its windows tinted, its license plate unfamiliar. The moment shifted. Every head turned toward the vehicle. Even Grant's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing. Jason Ellis exhaled for the first time in nearly 5 minutes, but the knot in his stomach only grew tighter. The black SUV glided to a stop at the edge of the market square, and as the driver's door opened, the real reckoning began. The heavy silence that had gripped Willow Creek's market tightened like a noose as the black SUV settled into its spot. The low growl of the engine faded, replaced by an eerie stillness that made the marketplace feel smaller, as if the walls of the little town had crept in closer. Even the buzzing cicadas seemed to quiet down for a beat. The tension wasn't just heavy, it was suffocating. Elena Brooks didn't flinch. She didn't turn to look at the SUV. She didn't glance at Officer Grant Mallory, still standing too close, his grin starting to tremble at the edges. She simply breathed, slow and steady, like a woman who had already lived through far worse storms than this little display of small-town power. With her right hand still resting by her side, her fingers slid into the pocket of her lavender silk dress. The fabric whispered against her skin, delicate but deliberate. From inside, she drew out a slim, black device, her phone. There was no fumbling, no hesitation. Her thumb hovered briefly above the screen as the sunlight caught the faint shimmer of the glass. Nobody in the crowd even noticed. They were too focused on the SUV, too busy pretending not to stare at the officers. Jason Ellis, standing behind Mallory, caught the movement only because he had been watching Elena more closely than anyone else, not with suspicion, but with something closer to unease. His training had taught him to observe everything, but he had never expected to feel this torn. Elena's thumb moved with the kind of precision that only comes from long practice. 3 taps, that's all it took. 1, 2, 3, no phone number dialed, no text message written. Instead, a small coded sequence appeared on the screen. At the top, a blinking line read Alpha 17, emergency signal sent, encryption active. The code disappeared just as quickly as it came, replaced by her normal home screen. Anyone who might have glanced over her shoulder would have seen nothing out of the ordinary. But somewhere far beyond Willow Creek in Washington, in the federal data hubs, in a system designed for moments just like this, red lights quietly flashed. The signal didn't just summon help, it activated an operation months in the making. A federal investigation into systemic abuse within small-town law enforcement, long buried beneath layers of silence and minor incidents, was now live. The agents monitoring the case didn't need more proof to act, they only needed the trigger. And Elena Brooks, standing there in that lavender silk dress under the sweltering southern sun, had just pulled it. Still, she showed no emotion. She didn't look at her phone again. She slipped it silently back into her pocket, folding her hands loosely in front of her like nothing at all had happened. Like this was simply another Saturday morning stroll through a small-town market. But inside her chest, beneath the calm exterior, her heart beat steady and strong, not racing from fear, not thudding from panic, but pulsing with the weight of quiet resolve. Because she knew as certain as the sun rose every morning that the gears of justice had now begun to turn. Grant Mallory, meanwhile, was still talking. Now, listen, ma'am, He started again, trying to regain the control that was slipping through his fingers. His voice had a forced politeness to it now, like a salesman still trying to close a deal even after the customer had walked out the door. You may not realize it, but refusing to cooperate can be seen as suspicious. We're just doing our job here, he said, voice lowering as he leaned in again, testing the boundaries of personal space. Elena neither backed up nor reacted. She simply raised her eyes to meet his. The stare that locked them together was like cold steel. It was not anger. It was not fear. It was something far more unnerving for men like Grant. It was dignity. The kind of dignity that didn't ask permission to exist. Jason Ellis swallowed hard behind them, sweat forming at his temples even though the breeze had started to pick up. His breathing was shallow, his hands twitching at his sides. He could feel it. The balance of power in this little dance was shifting, and deep down, he knew Grant didn't see it coming. Around them. The market remained trapped in its strange paralysis. Vendors who had once looked at Elena with curiosity now kept their heads down, pretending to organize their displays. The old woman at the yarn stall paused mid-stitch, eyes narrowing as she watched with a quiet knowing. Even Tommy Wells, who had lit this fire just minutes ago with his crude comment, had stepped back into the shadows behind his overflowing produce cart. No one spoke. No one moved. But in that stillness, the weight of accountability had already been set in motion. Then came the first subtle sign that the cavalry was coming. From the edge of the parking lot, less than 40 yards away, another vehicle appeared, this one smaller, nondescript. A black sedan with tinted windows, not a patrol car, not local. No markings at all. The kind of car that doesn't belong to anyone who needs to announce who they are. The kind of car that sends a chill down the spine of any officer who's ever danced too close to the edge. Grant Mallory finally noticed. His head snapped toward it for just a second. His confident grin faltered. His hand instinctively rested on his belt, hovering near his holstered weapon, not out of need, but out of habit. A defensive reflex. Jason's breath caught again. He recognized the plate. Federal. The market seemed to hold its collective breath as the sedan rolled to a stop behind the SUV, perfectly synchronized like pieces on a chessboard being moved into position. Elena stood unmoved. Her eyes never left Grant Mallory's face. She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She didn't say a word. Because she didn't need to. She had already won. The silence that gripped Willow Creek's market was now bone deep. You could have heard a pin drop. Even the buzzing flies hovering over Tommy Wells' overripe peaches seemed to pause mid-air. All eyes drifted toward the sleek black SUV that had parked just moments after the unmarked sedan rolled in. Its engine idled for a few seconds before shutting off with a quiet, almost deliberate sigh, like the final exhale before something irreversible was about to happen. Grant Mallory's chest tightened. The grin he'd carefully pasted onto his face just minutes earlier was gone now, replaced by a nervous tightness around his jaw. His fingers twitched near his duty belt, but even he knew this wasn't a situation a sidearm could solve. The SUV door opened. Out stepped a man who, at first glance, didn't look like much. Mid-40s, sharp but composed. His tailored gray suit was perfectly pressed, not a wrinkle in sight. His black leather shoes clicked once against the cracked concrete of the marketplace. No badge was visible. No weapon flashed at his side. But anyone who had spent any time around real power, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself, knew instantly this man was dangerous in a way few people ever get to see. In his right hand was a slim leather ID case. The gold lettering on its cover caught the morning light for just a breath before he flipped it open and held it high enough for both officers to see. Special Agent Daniel Monroe, United States Department of Justice, Internal Affairs, Civil Rights Division, he said, voice steady and sharp like a scalpel. And we're going to stop this little performance right now. Jason Ellis stiffened. His eyes shot toward Grant Mallory, but his feet remained frozen to the ground. His mind spun in circles, trying to process what exactly was unfolding. He had seen plenty of routine stops, plenty of unnecessary flexing of authority, but never anything like this. Grant's mouth opened, but nothing came out. The crowd wasn't whispering anymore. They weren't murmuring, gossiping, or pretending not to notice. No, now they were simply watching. Watching because they finally realized they were standing in the middle of something far bigger than two officers and one woman in a silk dress. And that woman, Elena Brooks, still hadn't said a word. Special Agent Monroe shifted his attention to her for the first time. His eyes softened for a brief second, giving her the kind of silent nod that spoke volumes. "You've done your part. We'll take it from here." "Elena Brooks," Monroe said clearly now, turning back toward the officers, but speaking loudly enough for everyone in the market to hear, "is not some random civilian you thought you could intimidate." Grant Mallory's face flushed red. "She is a federal undercover operative. She has been embedded here in Willow Creek for the last 9 months as part of an ongoing Department of Justice investigation into systemic misconduct, civil rights violations, and abuse of power within local law enforcement." It was like the air itself thickened. Tommy Wells, who had lit the fuse that morning, sank behind his fruit stand as if he could somehow make himself disappear. The vendors at the snack stalls stopped pretending to organize their pastries. The old woman with the yarn paused mid-stitch, frozen with both hands hovering over her basket. Her assignment, Monroe continued, his voice rising just slightly, was to gather first-hand evidence of unlawful conduct. What she has documented, including what has happened here today, will be used as part of a federal indictment that's already in motion. Jason Ellis's stomach twisted. He couldn't even blink. The weight of what Monroe had just revealed settled like a boulder on his chest. This wasn't a simple overstep. This wasn't a routine traffic stop. This wasn't some harmless joke gone too far. This was an operation. A trap. And they had walked right into it. Monroe took a slow step closer to Mallory, his tone cooling into something razor-sharp. "And you, Officer Mallory, have just provided us with the final piece we needed. The physical contact. The unauthorized stop. The harassment all done in full public view." Grant swallowed, but his throat was dry as sandpaper. Behind them, the two plain-clothed federal agents who had arrived with Monroe stepped quietly out of the sedan. They didn't say a word. They didn't have to. They moved like shadows, silent. Efficient, taking up positions that boxed Mallory and Ellis into a tightening perimeter. No more pretending. No more paperwork loopholes. No more internal reviews that go nowhere. Monroe added, dropping his voice just slightly. "Today is the last day your badge protects you." Elena Brooks remained standing precisely where she had been the entire time, calm, centered, and unshaken. The morning sunlight caught the soft sheen of her lavender silk dress as the breeze danced around her ankles. The very fabric Grant Mallory had dared to touch now shimmered like an unspoken symbol, not of fragility, but of power held still. You've got no right to pull this circus in public," Mallory finally managed, his voice cracking like dry wood under pressure. Monroe's stare turned ice cold. "I've got every right. Officer Mallory, Because you've forgotten one very important thing." He paused for dramatic weight, letting the words hit like a hammer drop. No one is above the law. It was over. Mallory's shoulders slumped under the invisible collapse of his world. Jason Ellis, breathing heavily beside him, felt as though the ground beneath his feet was no longer solid. From behind them, one of Monroe's agents spoke into a shoulder radio, his voice low but firm. "Notify headquarters. Subject secured. Phase 1 complete." The black SUV's back door opened, and for the first time, Elena Brooks took a single step forward. She glanced toward Agent Monroe, gave him a respectful nod, and then calmly walked toward the open vehicle, the silk of her dress gliding like water beneath her. The marketplace stayed frozen as she passed. Eyes followed her, not with suspicion now, but with something closer to reverence. People who once whispered behind her back now found their voices caught in their throats. Even those who once turned their heads to avoid seeing her could no longer pretend they hadn't. Elena's steps remained slow, deliberate, unbothered. And in that moment, as she quietly disappeared into the black SUV, Willow Creek felt for the first time in a very long time the unmistakable pulse of justice finally arriving. The silence that gripped Willow Creek's market was now bone-deep. You could have heard a pin drop. Even the buzzing flies hovering over Tommy Wells's overripe peaches seemed to pause mid-air. All eyes drifted toward the sleek black SUV that had parked just moments after the unmarked sedan rolled in. Its engine idled for a few seconds before shutting off with a quiet, almost deliberate sigh, like the final exhale before something irreversible was about to happen. Grant Mallory's chest tightened. The grin he'd carefully pasted onto his face just minutes earlier was gone now, replaced by a nervous tightness around his jaw. His fingers twitched near his duty belt, but even he knew this wasn't a situation a sidearm could solve. The SUV door opened. Out stepped a man who, at first glance, didn't look like much. Mid-40s, sharp but composed. His tailored gray suit was perfectly pressed, not a wrinkle in sight. His black leather shoes clicked once against the cracked concrete of the marketplace. No badge was visible. No weapon flashed at his side. But anyone who had spent any time around real power, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself, knew instantly this man was dangerous in a way few people ever get to see. In his right hand was a slim leather ID case. The gold lettering on its cover caught the morning light for just a breath before he flipped it open and held it high enough for both officers to see. Special Agent Daniel Monroe, United States Department of Justice Internal Affairs, Civil Rights Division, he said, voice steady and sharp like a scalpel. "And we're going to stop this little performance right now." Jason Ellis stiffened. His eyes shot toward Grant Mallory, but his feet remained frozen to the ground. His mind spun in circles, trying to process what exactly was unfolding. He had seen plenty of routine stops, plenty of unnecessary flexing of authority, but never anything like this. Grant's mouth opened, but nothing came out. The crowd wasn't whispering anymore. They weren't murmuring, gossiping, or pretending not to notice. No, now they were simply watching. Watching because they finally realized they were standing in the middle of something far bigger than two officers and one woman in a silk dress. And that woman, Elena Brooks, still hadn't said a word. Special Agent Monroe shifted his attention to her for the first time. His eyes softened for a brief second, giving her the kind of silent nod that spoke volumes. "You've done your part. We'll take it from here." "Elena Brooks," Monroe said, clearly now, turning back toward the officers, but speaking loudly enough for everyone in the market to hear. "Is not some random civilian you thought you could intimidate." Grant Mallory's face flushed red. "She is a federal undercover operative. She has been embedded here in Willow Creek for the last 9 months as part of an ongoing Department of Justice investigation into systemic misconduct, civil rights violations, and abuse of power within local law enforcement." It was like the air itself thickened. Tommy Wells, who had lit the fuse that morning, sank behind his fruit stand as if he could somehow make himself disappear. The vendors at the snack stalls stopped pretending to organize their pastries. The old woman with the yarn paused mid-stitch, frozen with both hands hovering over her basket. Her assignment. Monroe continued, his voice rising just slightly, was to gather first-hand evidence of unlawful conduct. What she has documented, including what has happened here today, will be used as part of a federal indictment that's already in motion. Jason Ellis's stomach twisted. He couldn't even blink. The weight of what Monroe had just revealed settled like a boulder on his chest. This wasn't a simple overstep. This wasn't a routine traffic stop. This wasn't some harmless joke gone too far. This was an operation, a trap, and they had walked right into it. Monroe took a slow step closer to Mallory, his tone cooling into something razor-sharp. "And you, Officer Mallory, have just provided us with the final piece we needed. The physical contact, the unauthorized stop, the harassment, all done in full public view." Grant swallowed, but his throat was dry as sandpaper. Behind them, the 2 plain-clothed federal agents who had arrived with Monroe stepped quietly out of the sedan. They didn't say a word. They didn't have to. They moved like shadows, silent, efficient, taking up positions that boxed Mallory and Ellis into a tightening perimeter. No more pretending. No more paperwork loopholes. No more internal reviews that go nowhere. Monroe added, dropping his voice just slightly, "Today is the last day your badge protects you." Elena Brooks remained standing precisely where she had been the entire time, calm, centered, and unshaken. The morning sunlight caught the soft sheen of her lavender silk dress as the breeze danced around her ankles. The very fabric Grant Mallory had dared to touch now shimmered like an unspoken symbol not of fragility, but of power held still. You've got no right to pull this circus in public," Mallory finally managed, his voice cracking like dry wood under pressure. Monroe's stare turned ice-cold. "I've got every right, Officer Mallory, because you've forgotten one very important thing." He paused for dramatic weight, letting the words hit like a hammer drop. No one is above the law." It was over. Mallory's shoulders slumped under the invisible collapse of his world. Jason Ellis, breathing heavily beside him, felt as though the ground beneath his feet was no longer solid. From behind them, one of Monroe's agents spoke into a shoulder radio, his voice low but firm. "Notify headquarters. Subject secured. Phase 1 complete." The black SUV's back door opened, and for the first time, Elena Brooks took a single step forward. She glanced toward Agent Monroe, gave him a respectful nod, and then calmly walked toward the open vehicle, the silk of her dress gliding like water beneath her. The marketplace stayed frozen as she passed. Eyes followed her not with suspicion now, but with something closer to reverence. People who once whispered behind her back now found their voices caught in their throats. Even those who once turned their heads to avoid seeing her could no longer pretend they hadn't. Elena's steps remained slow, deliberate, unbothered, and in that moment, as she quietly disappeared into the black SUV. Willow Creek felt for the first time in a very long time the unmistakable pulse of justice finally arriving. By the time the sun rose over Willow Creek on that Thursday morning, the town wasn't the same place it had been just a week ago. The story had already broken across state lines. News vans lined the old brick streets. Microphones jutted into the humid summer air, and reporters in neatly pressed suits spoke directly into cameras with words like systemic failure and institutional betrayal hanging heavy behind them. But none of that prepared anyone for what was about to happen next. At 8 o'clock sharp, the hearing room inside the Willow Creek Civic Center opened its doors. The room wasn't large, but the tension inside it stretched wider than any stadium. Journalists filled every seat, their recorders blinking red. Rows of law enforcement officers sat stiffly in their uniforms, many fidgeting under the weight of what was about to be revealed. At the front of the room stood a simple oak podium. Behind it, Special Agent Daniel Monroe, and right beside him sat Elena Brooks. She wore no robe of power, no title pinned to her chest, only that same lavender silk dress, pressed and immaculate, as if untouched by the storm swirling around her. She didn't speak. Not yet. Her gaze remained calm but sharp, scanning the room like a quiet reminder that no one here was above accountability. Monroe tapped the microphone once and said, "We are here today to hear from those whose voices were buried for far too long." The first to step forward was a woman older, but not fragile. She walked with a slow, steady grace, leaning gently on a polished wooden cane. Her name, Mrs. Clarissa Johnson. The room fell silent as she reached the microphone. She was 74 years old, a widow, a retired librarian who had lived in Willow Creek her entire life. She spoke softly, but her voice carried a power that no microphone could amplify. "My encounter with Officer Mallory happened 6 years ago, right outside the First Baptist parking lot," she began, her hands gripping the podium like anchors. "I had just finished my church's bake sale. I was wearing my Sunday dress. I guess that made me suspicious." A few uneasy murmurs rippled through the audience, but no one interrupted. "Mallory pulled me over while I was driving home," she continued, her voice steady but cracking at the edges. "He said my taillight was out. It wasn't. I told him that. He ordered me out of my car anyway, asked me to open my trunk. Then he told me I needed to spread my arms so he could make sure I wasn't carrying anything illegal." She paused, her breath hitched. Then she gathered herself. "He touched my waist while I stood there." She whispered, "Right there, on the side of the road. Broad daylight. Cars driving by. And I froze, because I didn't know what would happen if I told him to stop." Her eyes filled with tears, but her voice sharpened. "And when I reported it," she said bitterly, "they told me there wasn't enough evidence, that maybe I misinterpreted his actions, and I believed them until I saw this story on the news last week, until I saw this brave woman standing here." Mrs. Johnson turned her head and locked eyes with Elena. The two women exchanged a look that needed no words. For the first time, Mrs. Johnson was not alone. Monroe stepped forward. "Thank you, Mrs. Johnson. You've done more today than most ever dared." The next person to approach the stand wasn't someone the town expected to see. Officer Miguel Perez retired. Miguel had served Willow Creek for nearly 20 years. His uniform was long since replaced by civilian clothes, but his badge still sat in a small velvet box at home, buried under piles of old memories he had tried to forget. But today, His conscience had dragged him into this room. "I served under Mallory for 4 years before I retired," he began, his voice raspier but stronger with every word. "I saw things I should have reported. I didn't, and for that, I carry my own guilt." The room shifted uncomfortably. Several officers looked down at their polished shoes. Miguel's hands shook slightly, but his voice hardened. Mallory wasn't the only one doing it, but he was the one who made it routine. The random searches, the so-called ID checks on young women who just happened to be black or Latina. He'd call them out for suspicious attire, said things like, "Gotta make sure nothing's hiding under there." He thought it was funny. He exhaled, his shoulders slumping, and the rest of us, Miguel's voice grew quieter. We laughed, or we looked away, because that's how the system worked. The more you spoke up, the fewer friends you had, the fewer shifts you got, the fewer chances you had to keep your job. A quiet ache settled over the room. Miguel finished with a raw honesty that stunned even the most hardened listeners. "I failed to act when others needed me most. But I'm here now, because my silence helped keep this going. And if I don't speak today, I'll never forgive myself." Jason Ellis sat in the corner of the room, his face pale again. He clenched his jaw as Miguel spoke, because every word struck too close to home. Jason had stood in those same spots, laughed at the same disgusting jokes, nodded along just to stay safe. Now, the faces of the people he failed stared back at him. More witnesses followed after that. By noon that day, there were 6, all with stories eerily similar to Elena's, to Clarissa's, to dozens of others now surfacing. Names once buried in sealed complaint files were now finally breathing in open air. There was a young teacher, 25 years old, who had been stopped leaving a grocery store late at night. Mallory had demanded to search her shopping bags. There was a college student who'd been ordered to stand still while Mallory lifted the edge of her hoodie in public, citing probable cause for concealed substances. And there was a single father who recounted how Mallory had forced him to exit his car, handcuffing him in front of his 2 children for appearing nervous. Each voice was a chisel striking at the foundation of Willow Creek's long-held illusion of peace. By the end of the testimony, the public no longer questioned whether Elena Brooks' story was true. They questioned how they had allowed it to go on for so long. The walls of silence, those invisible bricks built by fear, shame, and complicity, had begun to crack. And with every voice that rose, those cracks spread wider. Elena still hadn't spoken. She hadn't needed to, because the witnesses were speaking for her now, and Willow Creek was finally listening. By the time Friday rolled around, just 5 days after Clarissa Johnson's voice broke the long silence, the entire state of Willow Creek stood on the edge of something it had never seen before. The courthouse steps were crowded before the sun even cracked the horizon. It was just after 6 in the morning. But reporters, protesters, victims, and onlookers filled the plaza like a flood that couldn't be contained, inside the grand marble building. The indictment hearing for Officer Grant Mallory was about to begin. For years, Grant had walked through these very halls with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable, his starched uniform always sharp, his polished boots always loud, his eyes always scanning for the next person to control. But now his uniform had been traded for a plain gray suit. His head was slightly bowed, his lips pressed thin. When the judge read aloud the charges, 4 counts of civil rights violations, 3 counts of assault under color of authority, and one count of obstruction of justice, the courtroom didn't gasp. No one was surprised anymore. The truth had been laid bare for all to see. For Willow Creek, for the state, and for the nation watching live on every major network. This wasn't just the fall of a single man. This was the collapse of an entire way of policing that had operated unchecked for far too long. As Grant sat frozen at the defense table, unable to meet the eyes of the witnesses who had spoken against him, Special Agent Daniel Monroe delivered his testimony with a calm but deadly precision. "This is not about one officer," Monroe said into the microphone. "This is about a culture, a system that allowed abuse to wear a badge and a gun, and called it standard procedure. And just like that, the ripples from Willow Creek turned into waves that reached the Capitol. By the following Tuesday morning, Senator Ruth Caldwell stood before Congress to introduce a groundbreaking piece of legislation. Cameras flashed, microphones hummed, and across living rooms, office break rooms, and coffee shops, people leaned closer to their screens as she spoke. The events that unfolded in Willow Creek have exposed not only individual misconduct, but the failure of oversight itself, Caldwell said. When a person's dignity can be stolen in public, in broad daylight, while others look away, we have failed as a nation built on liberty. She paused, scanning the chamber before continuing, "That is why I am introducing the Civil Dignity Protection Act." The words hit like a thunderclap. The act mandates that all public searches, detentions, and personal inspections by law enforcement officers be monitored in real time by a third-party oversight system completely independent of the agencies involved. No more sealed files. No more erased footage. No more silent witnesses. The room buzzed as her words settled. Under the new law, every single body camera, traffic stop dash cam, street search, and routine public inspection would be linked directly to a federal review system. AI-driven oversight would flag any signs of misconduct the moment they occurred. Civilian oversight boards, not internal affairs divisions, would review violations. And for the first time, officers standing nearby, who witnessed abuse and chose to stay silent, would themselves be held accountable under new passive complicity provisions. The Civil Dignity Protection Act would change law enforcement in America forever. But Senator Caldwell wasn't finished. "There will always be brave individuals like Elena Brooks," she said. "But justice should not depend on one woman's courage. It must be written into the very code of our laws." When she spoke Elena's name, even the cameras seemed to pause, capturing the weight of what one silent act had sparked. By the end of that week, the Senate voted 78 in favor, 22 against. The Civil Dignity Protection Act passed, and the dominoes began to fall. Nationwide, police training academies launched emergency curriculum overhauls. The days of see nothing, say nothing were over. Instead of spending hours rehearsing escalation drills, officers now spent equal time learning de-escalation, intervention, and accountability. In one new classroom inside the National Law Enforcement Academy, an ethics instructor stood before his first class under the new guidelines. Projected on the screen behind him was a still frame from the Willow Creek market. Elena's lavender silk dress, frozen mid-motion, as Officer Mallory's hand hovered at the hem. The instructor spoke quietly, without drama. "This photo will live in your mind long after your training ends, not because it shows brutality, but because it shows the moment silence allowed abuse to occur." He paced slowly across the front of the room, You'll be trained to intervene, to step forward. Because if you stand next to something wrong and choose to do nothing, you've already become part of the failure. Students sat still. No one joked. No one looked away. Across the country, reform reached even deeper into the system's roots. Internal affairs divisions were stripped of sole investigative power. New watchdog agencies, staffed by civilians and external legal experts, were created to review body cam footage within 72 hours of any reported incident. Meanwhile, hundreds of old complaints, many once dismissed as lacking evidence, were reopened. The files that had sat untouched for years were now evidence in newly launched federal investigations. Back in Willow Creek, the market reopened. The same stalls returned. The same vendors offered jars of honey, baskets of apples, and sunflowers bundled in twine. But one thing had changed forever. Where once stood the fruit stand where Tommy Wells had first mocked Elena, there now stood a small bronze plaque, embedded quietly in the brick path. It read, "Dignity is not a privilege. It's a right." Every Saturday morning, shoppers paused as they passed that plaque. Some bowed their heads, some whispered to their children, and some simply stood still, letting the silence speak the words they no longer needed to say aloud. Elena Brooks never sought interviews. She declined all offers for book deals or televised documentaries. She simply returned to her quiet life. But her stillness in that marketplace had cracked something open. The days of silent complicity were over, and across the country, justice had finally stepped forward. By the time spring rolled into Willow Creek, about 6 months after the Civil Dignity Protection Act had passed, the town had settled into a new kind of rhythm. Not the one built on whispered judgments and quiet avoidance, but something different. Something that felt like breathing fresh air after holding your breath for too long. The market reopened every Saturday morning, like it always had, by 7 o'clock. The vendors were there, unfolding their canvas canopies, stacking crates of apples, peaches, and jars of honey. The scent of fresh bread drifted across the air like a familiar song. And shoppers, coffee cups in hand, weaved between the stalls like nothing had changed. But everything had. Because, right there, at the corner where the bricks met the old fruit stand, the very same spot where Elena Brooks once stood tall in her lavender silk dress, sat a simple bronze plaque. There were no flowers around it, no elaborate statue or towering memorial, just 4 lines etched into the metal, quiet but unignorable. The silence once allowed it. Now, silence ends here. People didn't gather around it like tourists at a monument. They passed by. Some paused. Some whispered to their children. A few, mostly the older vendors who had been there that day, would glance down, nod quietly, and keep moving. It was there not to demand attention, but to ensure that no one would forget. Meanwhile, far beyond the brick-lined streets of Willow Creek, the ripple that started with Elena's silent resistance continued spreading like wildfire across the country. The Department of Justice, now operating under the full weight of the Civil Dignity Protection Act, rolled out mandatory national training standards. At the top of every ethics module, printed in bold black letters across every academy training room, sat the same mantra, see it, say it, stop it. It was short, simple, uncompromising. Every new recruit, whether in Texas or Vermont, big cities or small towns, would enter the academy with those words etched into their memory by the end of the first week. No more look the other way. No more not my place. No more hiding behind paperwork, protocol, or seniority. Now. They were taught that inaction was no different than participation. In one of those very classrooms, about 300 miles away, a young woman named Maya sat upright at her desk. She was 21 years old, barely 5'2", with sharp eyes that rarely blinked. She had grown up hearing about Willow Creek. In fact, like many in her class, she had watched the footage of Elena Brooks at least a dozen times. But on that particular morning, something different happened. The instructor, a tall man in his late 40s, stepped to the front of the room and powered up the projector. No sound, no narration, just that haunting black and white still frame frozen on the screen. Elena, standing calm beneath the market canopy, her lavender silk dress catching the wind, her head held high, while Officer Mallory reached forward with his hand. The room fell silent. "Take 10 seconds, the instructor said. "Look at this image, and ask yourself a question. Where would you have stood that day?" Nobody spoke, because the answer wasn't easy. The instructor lowered his voice, letting the silence fill the room before he continued. "Some of you think the lesson here is about abuse of power, but that's only half of it. The real test is whether you'd have stayed still and done nothing, just like the ones who watched." He turned toward the screen, nodding slightly as if speaking to Elena herself. "Your badge will not shield you from your choices. If you stand next to wrong and say nothing, you've already failed." The students remained frozen. This was no longer theory. This was no longer just a lecture. This was the standard. See it? Say it. Stop it. Later that afternoon, as class dismissed, Maya lingered. She pulled out a small notepad she always carried and jotted something on the first page. When silence feels safe. That's when speaking matters most. She didn't know then, but one day, years down the line, that sentence would be quoted in a national conference on ethical policing. But for now, it was enough that she wrote it at all. Back in Willow Creek, Elena Brooks continued her quiet life. She never accepted interviews, never signed book deals, and never once appeared on the covers of the many articles written about her. Producers called. Journalists begged. Even major networks offered to film documentaries. She turned them all down. And when a national lawmaker offered to name the new law after her, the Brooks Act, she declined politely, simply stating, "I didn't stand still for recognition. I stood still because someone had to." Instead, her contribution took a quieter form. Elena agreed only once to allow the Department of Justice to use her story, her footage, and her moment as the foundation for the new National Ethics Curriculum. She didn't narrate it, she didn't appear in person, but her silent strength, captured forever in that brief video clip, would become part of every recruit's training for years to come. Every June, when a fresh class of cadets sat down for their ethics orientation, the video played. The words came up on screen in this job. Power begins with restraint. Silence once allowed it. Now, silence ends here. Even those who were not there that day in Willow Creek knew exactly what those words meant. One Saturday morning, almost exactly 2 years later, Elena visited the market like she always did. She wore a simple navy dress, her head high, her steps calm. As she passed the plaque, a young officer, barely 25, stood nearby monitoring the market part of the new community presence initiative. He noticed her. He recognized her. But he didn't stare. Instead, he simply offered a respectful nod and said softly, "Thank you." Elena smiled, just slightly, and kept walking. Because, in that small, simple moment, no cameras, no headlines, no applause, she saw what had changed. The system hadn't just written new rules, it had finally grown new eyes. And sometimes, that was enough. And folks, what happened in Willow Creek isn't just some isolated story from a small town. No, this is a wake-up call for every one of us living here in America right now. Whether you're in a town of 5,000 or a city of 5 million. It's about understanding that silence, that quiet little decision to mind your own business, can sometimes cost someone their dignity, their safety, even their life. That simple act of not speaking up can turn you from a bystander into part of the problem. See, it took one woman, Elena Brooks, to stand still when every part of the system wanted her to shrink. And because of her courage, because she didn't lower her eyes or step back when power tried to humiliate her. We now have the Civil Dignity Protection Act protecting Americans in ways that didn't exist just a few years ago. That law, passed less than 2 years ago now, says that no officer can put their hands on you without real cause, real oversight, and a third-party witness. That's real change, folks. But let's be honest, laws alone aren't enough. The real lesson here is simple. See it, say it, stop it. That's not just for police officers, that's for all of us. Whether it's harassment, racism, abuse of power, or any injustice happening right in front of you, your voice matters. Even if you feel small, even if you feel scared. Because when one person steps up, it gives courage to others, and before long, the silence cracks. And that's how justice begins. Now, if this story hit you like it hit me, I need you to do something right now. Don't let this video end here. Hit that like button, smash it if you have to, so the algorithm knows this story matters. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss these powerful stories that America needs to hear. And please share this video. Send it to your friends, your co-workers, your family. Post it on Facebook, Twitter, wherever you're scrolling. Because stories like Elena's, they deserve to be told, again and again, until no one dares turn away. I'll see y'all in the next one. Stay safe, stay aware, and never be afraid to speak up when it matters.